The courtroom was packed. A dense silence hung over the crowd, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of a gavel. Behind the bench, Judge Elizabeth Carter adjusted her robe with deliberate calm. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the young man being escorted through the double doors in handcuffs, Billy Joe. He looked defiant, chin high, lips curled into a smirk that dared the world to strike him down. What no one in the room knew, not the bailiffs, not the attorneys, not even Billy Joe himself, was that the woman in the black robe was not just a judge. She was his mother. Decades ago, Elizabeth had given birth in secret, forced by circumstance and fear to give up her only child. She had followed his life from the shadows ever since, always watching but never intervening until now. Today, she would preside over the trial of her own son, and he had no idea. Billy Joe stood accused of inciting a violent protest that ended in fire, shattered glass, and public outrage. The evidence was mounting and the city demanded justice. To them, he was a criminal. To her, he was a lost boy from a past she had buried under layers of law and duty. As he was led to the defendant's seat, he locked eyes with her. He didn't flinch. He didn't recognize her. Instead, he offered a smirk laced with contempt. "Let's get this circus started," he muttered under his breath. Elizabeth's gavel struck once more. "This court is now in session. Stay with us through the end. What happens next will challenge your beliefs about justice, love, and sacrifice. Don't forget to subscribe. This is a story you won't forget." The echo of the gavel still lingered in Elizabeth Carter's ears long after the courtroom fell into its mechanical rhythm, but her mind wasn't in that room anymore. It was drifting, backward decades to a time when she wasn't Judge Carter, but simply Elizabeth, a frightened 17-year-old girl clutching her belly in a cold clinic waiting room. She had been brilliant even then, top of her class, already eyeing law school, already dreaming of change. But dreams have a way of shattering under the weight of reality. The father was gone before the first appointment. Her parents, conservative and unyielding, gave her two options: disappear until the birth and give the baby up, or give up everything else. She chose law, and she hated herself for it. The boy, her boy, was born in a Catholic hospital under a pseudonym. She wasn't allowed to hold him for more than a few minutes. His eyes were barely open, his fingers impossibly small as they gripped her pinky like he was begging her not to go. She whispered a name to him: Billy. It was the only gift she had to give. He was placed into the system and sent across state lines to a group home in Jefferson County. She tracked him quietly, obsessively. Not by letters or phone calls, that would have been too dangerous, but through annual reports, scraps of information, and favors from contacts who owed her more than a few secrets. And it wasn't long before the reports turned grim. By age 7, Billy Joe had been moved 3 times. Defiant, one file said. Emotionally withdrawn, said another. Elizabeth read each word like a wound. When he was 10, he got into a fight with an older boy who tried to steal his dinner. That was the first time she saw a picture of him with a black eye, and the last time she allowed herself to cry. He was smart. God, he was smart. Teachers noted a sharp mind, but one resistant to authority. He doesn't listen, they wrote. He questions everything. Elizabeth felt a strange pride swell in her chest. He was like her, but he was also alone. By 15, Billy Joe had stopped appearing in regular records. He'd run away from a foster home and fallen off the grid. She hired a private investigator just for peace of mind, she told herself. He was found 2 weeks later, squatting in an abandoned warehouse with 3 other teens, organizing what they called a justice collective. They handed out food. They painted murals. They read Marx, and they hated the system that raised them. She watched him grow into an activist. He had charisma, fire, and a reckless edge. He made enemies quickly, especially in high places. Elizabeth never interfered. She told herself it would do more harm than good. She was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to be anything but invisible in his world. And now here he was, in her courtroom. The door behind her creaked, pulling her out of memory. Her assistant, Miranda, entered quietly and placed a file on her desk. Preliminary evidence reports on the Brook Square riot, she whispered. Elizabeth opened the folder with trembling fingers. Surveillance stills, police interviews. A blurry photo of Billy Joe, mouth open mid-chant, standing atop a broken statue with a burning flag behind him. In another, he's handcuffed on the ground, blood trickling from his lip. The file included charges, incitement, vandalism, obstruction. There was talk of escalating it to domestic terrorism. Miranda lingered a second too long. "Is something wrong, Judge?" Elizabeth blinked. Her voice came cool and practiced. "No, just another case." But it wasn't. Her gaze drifted back to the courtroom where Billy Joe now sat, legs crossed, arms folded, still radiating that dangerous mix of brilliance and rage. He was no longer the baby who gripped her finger. He was a storm she had helped create, and now she was being asked to tame it. Not as a mother, as a judge. Billy Joe had never been one to sit still. Even now, in a courtroom charged with the weight of his alleged crimes, he lounged like he was in a diner booth, not facing up to 20 years behind bars. His fingers drummed against the wood of the defendant's table, and every now and then his eyes scanned the crowd with a detached smirk. He didn't respect the room, the people in it, or the laws they represented. He especially didn't respect the woman in the black robe. Judge Carter, to him, was just another cog in the machine that had tried to crush him since birth. He didn't know her name until a few hours before the hearing, but once he did, he'd looked her up. Pristine record, Harvard grad, no known family, a ghost made of rules. "Perfect," he had muttered to his lawyer. "Another ice queen who thinks justice is a spreadsheet." His lawyer, Vincent Greeley, had nodded with an oily smile. "Don't worry, we'll break her down. The court of public opinion is already on your side." Greeley was slick, always dressed like he was auditioning for a legal drama. He had an agenda: win a high-profile case, turn Billy Joe into a symbol, and ride the wave to political fame. He didn't care about Billy's cause. He cared about headlines. "Listen," Greeley said, leaning in during the recess. "You need to play this smart. Be loud, defiant, let her lose her temper." Billy Joe laughed dryly. "You think I need coaching to piss someone off?" "No," Greeley said. "But I want you to direct it. Aim it at her." Billy Joe didn't need much convincing. He had grown up allergic to authority. Every foster home had felt like a prison, every rule a new form of control. Teachers called him difficult. Caseworkers called him ungrateful. But he remembered the nights alone with his fists clenched, trying to quiet the noise in his chest that told him, "You don't belong here." Now, at 23, he had taken that noise and turned it into a battle cry. His protests had started small, a few picket signs, a megaphone in a campus square, but it grew quickly. Videos of his fiery speeches circulated online. He became a hero to the disillusioned, a villain to the establishment. When Brook Square burned, he was there. He didn't throw the first rock, but he didn't stop it either. He believed in the cause. He needed to believe in it. Because if the system wasn't broken, then what was the excuse for all the pain it had caused him? When the judge returned to the bench, the courtroom stood. Billy Joe rose lazily, like it was a chore. As the audience sat, he remained standing a few seconds longer, just enough to be noticed. His eyes met hers again. Still, he saw nothing familiar in them. Judge Carter's voice was calm, almost cold. "The defense will proceed." Before Greeley could speak, Billy Joe stepped forward. "Permission to speak, Your Honor," he said with mock courtesy. A flicker of hesitation crossed Elizabeth's face. She nodded. Billy leaned on the podium, eyes sweeping across the room. "You all keep talking about justice like it's some holy thing, like it was built to protect people like me. But this courtroom isn't about truth. It's about control." Greeley looked alarmed. This wasn't scripted. Billy pressed on. "You're all looking at me like I'm the enemy. But I didn't break this country. I didn't gut the foster system. I didn't write the laws that lock up poor kids for stealing food. I just refused to shut up about it." Then, turning back to Judge Carter with a venom-laced grin, "And you, sitting there in that robe, pretending you're neutral. I see you. You're just another suit playing God." Elizabeth's jaw tensed, but she didn't react. Inside, though, something cracked. She wanted to stand, to scream, "I'm not pretending," but she stayed silent even as the echo of his words stung deeper than he could ever imagine. She had waited her entire life to hear her son speak freely, and now that he had, every word was a knife. Elizabeth Carter sat motionless behind the bench, but inside her a storm was beginning to rage. Billy's words still echoed through her. "You're just another suit-playing god." He had no idea how wrong he was, and yet, how right. She had spent her life cloaked in silence. That silence had become her armor, her weapon, and now her prison. She had built a career on control, over herself, over her courtroom, over the chaos of a broken world. But nothing had prepared her for the moment when her own son would stand before her. Not as a child, not as a man she raised, but as a stranger sharpening words like arrows. That night, alone in her chambers, she removed her robe with the same care she'd always used, habit, ritual. But this time it felt heavier. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat before a locked drawer in her desk. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked it and pulled out a worn manila envelope labeled Billy, confidential. Inside were years of shadows, copies of adoption papers, photos printed from old yearbooks and protest articles, police records, every piece of a life she had been too afraid to touch, now spread across her desk like evidence in a trial she could no longer avoid. Her eyes landed on a photo of Billy at 17, standing on the steps of a courthouse with a sign that read, "The system failed me. Don't let it fail the next kid." He looked angry. He looked alive. And she wasn't in the picture, though everything about him screamed of her, his jawline, his posture, the defiant set of his mouth. Suddenly, her office door creaked open. Miranda, her assistant, peeked in. "Sorry, Judge, there's a journalist in the lobby asking questions about the Brooks case, about you." Elizabeth blinked, clearing her throat. "Did you tell them anything?" "Of course not." Miranda hesitated. "But they knew about your old name. Liz Holloway. Said they were looking into sealed records." Elizabeth's spine straightened. That name hadn't been spoken aloud in years. She thought she'd buried it with the girl who gave birth in the shadows. "Tell them no comment, and Miranda. That name is not to be repeated." Miranda nodded, though the worry in her eyes lingered. Once alone, Elizabeth returned to the file. Among the documents was a small envelope, yellowed at the edges. It was unsealed. She recognized her own handwriting, young, slanted, and uncertain. She unfolded the letter. The words spilled out in a trembling voice she barely remembered. "My dearest son, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you in person. I am your mother. I gave you away not because I didn't love you, but because I was scared, because I believed I was protecting you. But not a day goes by that I don't wonder who you've become, what kind of man you are, and if you could ever forgive me." She folded it back quickly, as if the truth might set fire to the room. There was no forgiving what she had done. She had abandoned him, not to cruelty, but to indifference, which in some ways was worse. And now the world was watching. The city was tense, waiting for her to pass judgment. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse every day. Some painted murals of Billy Joe with a halo. Others called him a domestic threat. Elizabeth knew the courtroom was no longer just about law. It was a stage, and on that stage she was walking a tightrope between integrity and devastation. Later that week, during a recess, a young journalist cornered her in the courthouse parking garage. "Judge Carter," he called out, "do you have any comment on the rumors you're related to the defendant?" She froze. "I don't respond to speculation," she said sharply. "But the records—" She raised her hand. "That's enough." As she stepped into her car and shut the door, her reflection stared back from the rearview mirror, composed, elegant, unreadable. But behind her eyes, something had shifted. The past was no longer behind her. It was here, in the courtroom, in the streets, in her son's voice. And it was demanding to be heard. Billy Joe sat in the holding room, the hum of the fluorescent lights above him matching the restless churn in his chest. The room smelled of bleach and metal, cold, impersonal. Just like the court, just like every home he'd ever been shoved into. But this time, the weight in his stomach wasn't about the system, It was about her. That judge, Carter, there was something about her he couldn't shake. The way she looked at him. The silence between them wasn't just judicial, it was personal. It buzzed under his skin. He didn't know her, but somehow it felt like she knew him. Across the table, Greeley scrolled through a tablet, rehearsing tomorrow's line of questioning. We'll push the narrative hard. The system targets the outspoken. Make you a martyr if we have to. Their press is itching for it. Billy frowned. You don't even care if I go to prison, do you? Greeley barely looked up. You want the world to hear you? Then this is how it works. They've already painted you as the enemy. I'm just making you a symbol. Billy leaned back. I'm not your brand. You're not, Greeley said flatly. You're my opportunity. Let's not confuse the two. The words stung more than he expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He'd let himself get swept up in the energy, the slogans, the rage. But lately, he'd started to feel like a passenger in his own cause. Everyone wanted something from him. Even the people who claimed to fight beside him seemed to be writing their own stories, using his name. And now he was supposed to trust a lawyer who wore $2,000 suits and rehearsed empathy like it was part of his job description. He stood and paced the room, fists clenched. She doesn't flinch, he muttered. Who? Greeley asked. The judge, Carter. Greeley shrugged. She's just a statue with a gavel, don't overthink it. But Billy was overthinking it. Every time he looked into her eyes, he felt a strange pull, like gravity. Like something important was just out of reach. He thought back to what she'd said when court opened. This court is now in session. Her voice hadn't cracked, not even when he'd tried to provoke her. Most judges recoiled when he spoke, she didn't. She just absorbed it, like someone who already knew how much pain words could carry. Back in her chambers, Elizabeth stared at a copy of the day's transcript, red pen in hand. But her eyes weren't on the paper. They were fixed on the memory of Billy's face. The way he walked, the way he spoke with that deliberate confidence. Every syllable was a protest against silence, every glare a challenge. He wasn't just fighting a legal battle, he was fighting his own reflection. She could see it clearly now. He didn't trust anyone, not his lawyer, not the system, not the crowd cheering him on. And that mistrust was being used against him. She flipped through the evidence report again. There were inconsistencies, small but enough to raise red flags. A surveillance tape with a 2-minute gap. A witness statement altered after being submitted. And Greeley, he hadn't questioned any of it. He hadn't wanted to. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the file. Was Greeley sabotaging the case on purpose? Not for justice, but for spectacle. She'd seen it before. Ambitious lawyers riding public outrage like a wave. But this time, the wave had a face. Her son's. The next morning before the court reconvened, she called a brief meeting with the prosecution and defense. Greeley walked in late, sipping an espresso. You wanted something? He asked casually. Elizabeth's voice was sharp. There's been an inconsistency in the timeline of the Brooks footage. I expect your team to review it before we proceed. Greeley's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, Judge. Anything you say. As he turned to leave, Billy, already in the courtroom, caught the tail end of their exchange through the glass door. The look on Carter's face wasn't just official, it was personal. And for the first time, something inside him whispered, she's not just a judge. The courthouse was quiet in the early hours before trial. A pale light crept through the blinds of Elizabeth's private office as she sat alone, the unopened envelope lying in front of her, like a confession too long delayed. The letter, the one she'd written 2 decades ago for Billy, felt heavier than any gavel she had ever held. She had written it on the day she signed the final adoption papers, hands trembling, eyes swollen from crying. It was meant to be her voice in case she never had the courage to speak to him in person, and until now she hadn't. She traced her fingers across the folded paper, then picked it up, slowly unfolding it. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still held their shape, still held their weight. My dearest son. Her throat tightened. She couldn't read any further. There was only one person left alive who had been with her that day. Sister Eloise, a retired nurse who had worked at the hospital where Billy had been born. Elizabeth hadn't spoken to her in years, but she knew exactly where to find her. That afternoon, under the guise of a lunch break, she drove 30 minutes out of the city to a modest convent tucked into the hills. The front garden smelled of lavender and soil, untouched by time or scandal. Sister Eloise opened the door herself, her silver hair tied in a simple knot, eyes still sharp behind thin spectacles. "Liz Holloway," the sister said gently. "I knew this day would come." Elizabeth smiled sadly. "I don't go by that name anymore." "But you're still her," the sister replied. "You never stopped being her." Inside, over tea, Elizabeth unfolded everything. The trial, Billy's arrest, the secrecy, her fear. Sister Eloise listened in silence, her fingers folded neatly on her lap. "I thought if I stayed away," Elizabeth said, voice trembling, "he'd be safer. I thought the distance would protect him." "And now?" the sister asked. "I see him tearing himself apart in that courtroom," she whispered. "And he doesn't even know why." Sister Eloise nodded, then reached into a drawer beside her. From it, she pulled out a small wooden box and placed it gently on the table. "I kept this," she said softly, "in case he ever came looking. But maybe it's not him who needed to look." Inside the box was a Polaroid photo, Elizabeth holding Billy for the first and only time, her eyes red from crying, her smile fragile but real. And beneath the photo, folded carefully, was a second letter. One Elizabeth had written but never sent. Sister Eloise handed it to her. "You wrote it for him. But maybe you need to read it too." That night, back in her apartment, Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed and opened the letter again. This time, she forced herself to read every line. "I don't know who you'll become. I don't know if you'll ever know me. But I want you to know that you were never unloved, you were never unwanted. I let you go because I believed it was the only way to give you something better. I see now that I might have been wrong, and if I was, I'm so sorry." Tears slid silently down her cheeks. "If you ever find me, I'll be waiting." But he hadn't found her. She had found him, too late perhaps, but she was here now, and maybe that still meant something. The next morning, as she walked through the courthouse doors, the weight of the letter pressed against her chest like a hidden truth. Meanwhile, across the hall, Billy Joe was pacing again. Something was gnawing at him. Not nerves, not fear. Something deeper. That feeling from before was still there, crawling beneath his skin. That look in Judge Carter's eyes, the way she spoke his name, not like it was just part of a case file, but like she had known it all along. He pulled out a slip of paper where he'd scribbled a few things he'd overheard and researched: court names, adoption codes, and a name, Liz Holloway. The dots weren't connecting yet, but they were getting closer. The courtroom buzzed that morning with an energy Elizabeth couldn't quite name. Tension always simmered in high-profile cases, but today it felt different, like the walls themselves were listening. She took her seat at the bench with practiced calm, but her eyes immediately drifted to Billy Joe. He wasn't lounging today. He sat still, alert, his brows furrowed in thought. Something was shifting. Across the aisle, Greeley entered the courtroom, late again, phone still in hand. He was whispering into it, then slipped it into his jacket as if nothing had happened. Elizabeth's gaze followed him with more scrutiny now. Ever since she'd flagged the timeline inconsistency, he'd grown more cautious around her, polite, even agreeable, but behind that smile was calculation. As the session began, the prosecution presented new footage, recovered from a nearby store's private camera. The angle showed Billy at Brooks Square, but not at the time the fire started. In fact, it showed him leaving the scene minutes before the first object was thrown. The footage was time-stamped and geolocated, clean evidence. Elizabeth glanced at Greeley. His face remained neutral. But Billy noticed something. He leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "We didn't have that clip yesterday. Why didn't you ask for the original surveillance from the shops nearby?" Greeley didn't turn. "It wouldn't have helped us." Billy narrowed his eyes. "But it does help us. It proves I wasn't there when it started." "I said drop it," Greeley muttered, his jaw tight. Elizabeth caught the exchange. After the recess, Billy returned to the holding area, seething. He paced again, his frustration boiling over. "He's hiding something," he said to the guard, who simply shrugged and turned up the volume on the small TV in the corner. Billy sat and pulled out the notes he'd been keeping, court documents, names, fragments of memories. The name Liz Holloway circled in red ink. He'd found it on a sealed juvenile court file connected to his own adoption. It wasn't much, but it felt like a crack in the wall. And now he was beginning to see that maybe his biggest enemy wasn't the system, but the man who claimed to be fighting it beside him. That afternoon, Elizabeth returned to her chambers and called in her law clerk. "I want all communication logs between the defense and the press over the past 2 weeks. Anything public, anything leaked, track it." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Do you suspect misconduct?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Just a precaution." Within hours, the results were on her desk. A leak trail, statements from Greeley's firm, matching nearly verbatim with early press narratives. A key witness's address had been published online. Even private case details had surfaced in an op-ed column 2 days before they were made public in court. It was enough for a formal complaint, but that would take time and public exposure. Instead, Elizabeth made a quiet move. When court resumed, she called a sidebar. "Mr. Greeley," she said, her voice like ice. "A word." They stepped to the bench. She lowered her voice, her eyes sharp. "You've been leaking trial information for your own benefit. You're not defending your client. You're using him." Greeley didn't deny it. "I'm controlling the story, Your Honor. It's strategy." "You're endangering a defendant's right to a fair trial." He leaned in slightly. "Come now. Let's not pretend you're here for fairness either." The jab landed. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. "You will refrain from speaking to the press again, or I will hold you in contempt." Greeley smiled, cold and smug. "You wouldn't dare. Not with your secrets hanging by a thread." Their eyes locked. For a moment, everything stopped. Then she turned away. "Back to your table, counselor." Billy watched the exchange. He couldn't hear the words, but he read body language like a second language. And something in Judge Carter's eyes had changed. Not hard, not angry, but fierce, protective. For the first time, he wondered, whose side is she really on? The courtroom was silent, but not in the usual way. There was a different kind of stillness now, expectant like the pause before a storm breaks. Elizabeth Carter sat straighter than usual, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her mind raced, but her face remained unreadable. She had built an entire career on that expression. Billy Joe sat motionless too. Something in the air told him that today would be different, and he was right. The prosecution called their next witness, a retired maintenance worker from the now-defunct Jefferson County orphanage. The man was in his 70s, hunched and slow-moving, but his eyes were sharp. His name was Harold Brenner, and his testimony was supposed to confirm Billy's early behavioral issues, evidence to suggest a pattern of defiance. He was sworn in, and the questioning began. "Mr. Brenner, during your time at Jefferson, do you recall a boy named Billy Joe?" Harold nodded. "Oh yes. He was a fighter. Not just with fists. He fought everything, rules, routines, silence." There were scattered laughs in the gallery. Billy didn't move. "And did he ever mention his parents to you?" Harold paused, thoughtful. "Only once. He asked me if his mom had named him. I didn't know how to answer. So I told him. Maybe she named him Billy because it meant protector. He liked that." A quiet wave of emotion passed through the room. Elizabeth felt it settle in her chest like a stone. But what came next was worse. Harold turned his gaze toward the bench. "You look familiar, Your Honor," he said slowly. "Were you ever at Jefferson? Not as a judge, I mean." "Before." The words sliced through the room. Billy's head turned sharply. Elizabeth's spine straightened, but her voice came calmly. "No, Mr. Brenner. That would have been a long time ago." The lawyer tried to move on, but Harold squinted harder. "You had a different name then, Liz Holloway." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Greeley dropped his pen. Billy froze. The silence stretched into something unbearable. Elizabeth's mouth opened, but no sound came. She felt the air thicken around her, every cell in her body screaming that this moment had come too soon. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Not before she had the chance to tell him herself. Billy stood abruptly. "That's not true," he said, but his voice cracked. "Mr. Joe, please remain seated," she said almost instinctively. "No." He turned fully toward her now. "You knew my name. You knew me, didn't you?" Elizabeth swallowed hard. The gavel was in her hand, but she couldn't raise it. "I think we need a recess," the prosecutor said quickly. "Motion granted," Elizabeth said, barely audible. She rose from the bench and disappeared into her chambers, the courtroom behind her erupting into chaos. Billy didn't move. He stood rooted, eyes on the door she had just vanished behind. In the judge's chambers, Elizabeth stood trembling in front of the mirror. She no longer saw a judge. She saw a frightened girl in hospital whites holding a baby and whispering his name. She saw a woman who had hidden for too long. On the other side of the wall, Billy sat alone at the defense table. Greeley tried to say something, but Billy held up a hand. "Don't." His thoughts spun, memories flashing in fast, jagged pieces. That strange pull he had felt, the way she looked at him, the quiet, controlled pain in her eyes every time he spoke. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the note he had scribbled, Liz Holloway, and next to it, now underlined twice, he wrote, Judge Carter, Liz. It didn't make sense, and at the same time, it made too much sense. He had always believed his mother never wanted him, but what if she had been here the whole time, watching, listening, judging, not him but herself? The hallway outside the courtroom had turned into a war zone of whispers. Reporters crowded the entrance, snapping photos, recording live streams, speculating in real time. Judge Elizabeth Carter, also known as Liz Holloway, possibly the birth mother of the defendant. The headlines were writing themselves. Inside her chambers, Elizabeth sat motionless. The door was locked, the blinds drawn. In front of her sat the two letters, one from the past and one from just days ago, both now open, both now irrelevant. The truth had erupted before she could shape it, and all that remained was the wreckage. She had two choices: recuse herself, step down, protect what little reputation she had left, or stay, face him, face the world. And finally tell the truth, not with a letter, not in silence, but where it mattered most. She looked at the mirror across the room. Her reflection didn't look composed anymore. It looked human. That terrified her and freed her at the same time. Across the courthouse, Billy Joe sat in the defense lounge, staring at the envelope she had once dropped during a recess and picked up quickly. It hadn't seemed important then, but now, he reached into his pocket and opened his phone. A name, Liz Holloway, still sat in his recent search history. One photo came up from a 1984 college yearbook. She was younger, smiling, a law student. And yet, the eyes were the same. "I should have known," he muttered. Greeley entered the room behind him. "You need to prepare for the fallout," he said. "This revelation may get the whole trial thrown out. We can spin it. Victim of judicial bias, emotional trauma. You'll walk, Billy." Billy turned slowly. "You knew, didn't you?" Greeley froze. "Excuse me. You knew. You've been leaking things to the press. You used me. And you didn't even tell me the woman judging my life is my mother. I didn't know for sure, but you suspected," Billy said, his voice sharp. "And you kept it quiet because it made a better show." Greeley held up his hands, but Billy wasn't listening anymore. "You're fired," he said. "I don't need a puppet master. I need the truth." Back in the courtroom, Elizabeth emerged from her chambers to a stunned silence. Her robe seemed heavier now, but she wore it anyway. She walked to the bench and didn't sit. Instead, she stood behind it, eyes scanning the room. "I am calling a special address," she said, voice steady. "Before we proceed with this case, I must place something on the record." Greeley began to rise, but she raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Greeley." He obeyed. Elizabeth took a breath that felt like fire in her lungs. Then she spoke. 23 years ago, I gave birth to a son. Due to circumstances I regret to this day, I surrendered him for adoption. His name was Billy. I was 17. And I've lived every day since trying to live with the consequences. Murmurs erupted, gasps. A camera clicked. Elizabeth continued. The man sitting in that chair today, Billy Joe, is my son. He does not know me. He has every right to hate me. But the law requires honesty, and the law is what I swore to uphold. She paused, eyes fixed on him. I should have told you privately. I should have had the courage years ago. But now that the truth is out, I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not continue this trial from this bench. Billy's eyes didn't leave hers. I am recusing myself effective immediately, she said. A new judge will be assigned. The case will proceed without bias, without burden. And with that, she stepped down. Billy stood not out of protocol but out of instinct. They faced each other for the first time without the veil of titles, without the armor of roles. I don't know what to say, he muttered. You don't have to, she replied. Not yet. They stood there for a breath too long. Then the bailiff called order, and the court prepared to resume. But everything had changed. The courtroom looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The next day, Judge Raymond Delaney took the bench, a seasoned jurist with a reputation for efficiency and zero tolerance for theatrics. He reviewed the case files with cold precision, barely acknowledging the media frenzy surrounding the trial's explosive twist. Cameras were banned, spectators were limited, but tension still leaked through the walls like smoke. Billy Joe sat at the defense table alone, arms folded, jaw tight. No lawyer, no advisors. Greeley was gone, replaced by a court-appointed standby counsel who had been instructed not to speak unless directly addressed. Billy had made it clear he'd speak for himself now. Delaney looked down over his glasses. Mr. Joe, are you prepared to represent yourself in this matter? Yes, Your Honor, Billy said, voice steady. I am. Very well. Proceed. Billy stood slowly. The room felt larger without the weight of accusation pressing him into the floor. He walked to the center like a man approaching a cliff, no hesitation but fully aware of the fall beneath. I won't waste your time with speeches, he began. I've been labeled a lot of things, arsonist, threat, terrorist, but none of that matters if I wasn't even there when the fire started. He reached into a folder and held up a printed still from the newly introduced video footage. This shows me leaving Brook Square at 4:42 p.m. The fire was reported at 4:48. That's 6 minutes after I was gone. He passed the image to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Billy continued, You've heard people say I incited the crowd, that I gave some speech that pushed everything over the edge. But what no one's shown is any proof of that. No audio, no video, just assumptions. Why? Because I talk loud? Because I've got followers? He turned to the gallery. Maybe I am angry. Maybe I did want to shake people awake, but I didn't start that fire. And I didn't come here to be anyone's puppet. Not the movements, not my old lawyers, and not the systems. The judge looked at the prosecution. Do you wish to cross-examine? The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Alvarez, stood and approached with caution. Mr. Joe, she said, can you deny that you were seen earlier that day leading chants, encouraging resistance against police presence? No, Billy said plainly. I led chants. I encouraged protest. I encouraged awareness, not violence. But you admit you used provocative language. Freedom is always provocative to people who benefit from silence, he shot back. Alvarez hesitated. And your relationship with Judge Carter, Billy cut in, has nothing to do with this trial anymore. She recused herself. This is about what I did or didn't do, so let's stay on that. The judge nodded, impressed despite himself. Point taken, please proceed. Billy took his seat again. His heart pounded, but outwardly he was calm. He could feel the eyes on him, but none mattered more than the one pair missing from the room. Elizabeth wasn't there. She had disappeared from the courthouse entirely. No public comment, no statement, no farewell. And yet, in every word Billy spoke, she was there. She was in his refusal to be silenced, in the clarity of his defense, in the way he chose honesty over spectacle. For the first time, he wasn't performing. He was speaking. Outside the courthouse, Elizabeth sat in her parked car 3 blocks away, watching the live transcript updates from a court clerk's encrypted feed. She couldn't be there in person. She didn't deserve to be. But when she read the words Billy had spoken, his refusal to blame, his choice to stand alone, she broke. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent and full. He was stronger than she had ever been. He wasn't just her son, he was himself. Back in the courtroom, Judge Delaney adjusted his glasses. "We'll reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. Court is adjourned." Billy stood quietly gathering his papers. As he turned to leave, a folded note was slipped into his hand by a young intern. No name, no stamp. Just 3 words in careful handwriting. "I'm still here." The courtroom was unusually quiet the next morning. The crowd had thinned, some from fatigue, others from the sense that the drama had already peaked. But the tension hadn't faded. If anything, it had condensed into something sharper. Everyone knew this would be the final act. Billy Joe sat at the defense table, the folded note still in his pocket. "I'm still here." He'd read it at least 20 times, replaying the handwriting in his mind. It was unmistakably hers, elegant, precise, restrained. But more than the words, it was what they didn't say that unsettled him. She hadn't apologized, she hadn't begged, she had simply shown up in the only way she could. Judge Delaney entered and called the court to order. "We'll begin with closing statements. Defense, you may proceed." Billy stood, papers in hand, but after a pause, he set them down. "I had a speech prepared," he began. "Something neat, something that would make headlines, but I don't think that's what I need right now." He took a slow breath, then looked directly at the jury. "This case was never about just a riot, or a statue, or even a fire. It's about what happens when people stop being heard. I've spent most of my life screaming into a system that felt deaf. And when it finally listened, it wasn't because I found the right words, it was because I was on trial." He stepped closer. "Did I protest that day? Yes. Did I raise my voice? Absolutely. But did I tell anyone to burn anything, to hurt anyone? No. I came to fight with truth, and if that's a crime, then maybe I do belong here." There was a long silence. Even the jury seemed to hold its breath. Then the prosecutor, Alvarez, rose. "Your Honor, before I begin, the state would like to enter a late exhibit into the record." The courtroom stirred. Judge Delaney raised a brow. "Explain." "We received a sworn affidavit this morning," she said, lifting a document, "from a civilian witness. It directly impacts the timeline of the alleged incitement." She handed it to the clerk, who brought it to the bench. Delaney scanned the pages, his expression changed. "This witness is unaffiliated with either party?" "Yes, Your Honor." "A retired local shop owner whose business shares a wall with the alley adjacent to Brooks Square." The judge gave a short nod. "Proceed." Alvarez turned to the jury. "The witness confirms that at the exact time the fire started, Mr. Joe was seen exiting the alley several blocks away, carrying supplies for a first aid station. The witness also recalls hearing him shout, 'No fire, keep it peaceful.' This corroborates the new video evidence introduced earlier." The courtroom erupted into a low buzz. Billy blinked. He hadn't known anyone had heard him that day. He remembered shouting those exact words, but in the chaos they'd felt useless, like trying to put out a blaze with your bare hands. Alvarez continued. "The state recognizes that while Mr. Joe's rhetoric may be passionate, there is insufficient evidence to prove incitement beyond a reasonable doubt." She closed the folder gently. "The prosecution rests." Billy sat down slowly, heart pounding. He wasn't sure if what he felt was relief or something deeper. The case was collapsing, but not because of some flashy defense or legal maneuver. It was collapsing under truth, and that truth had found its way through the noise. Judge Delaney turned to the jury. "You are hereby instructed to deliberate based on the full scope of evidence presented, including the newly admitted statement. Court is recessed until a verdict is reached." The jury filed out. Billy sat in stillness, staring forward. His fists were clenched in his lap, not from fear, but because for the first time in his life someone had spoken for him. Not his lawyer, not a protest chant, just a quiet shop owner who had seen him. Outside the courthouse, a figure stood behind tinted windows, watching from a black sedan. Elizabeth Carter didn't need to be inside to feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't a judge now. Or a ghost. She was a mother, waiting for the world to decide what kind of man her son had become. 3 weeks later, the verdict was in. Not guilty, on all major charges. The courtroom had erupted in a mix of cheers and stunned silence. Billy Joe hadn't celebrated. He hadn't even smiled. He just closed his eyes and exhaled long and slow, like someone finally stepping out of a storm. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't post on social media. He vanished. But not entirely. Months passed. Rumors circulated. Some said he'd moved to the mountains. Others said he was working quietly with underprivileged youth in small towns. No cameras, no chance, just presence. In a rural community center 2 states away, a woman walked in one morning with a donation envelope. Inside was a photo, a baby gripping a young woman's finger, their faces close but blurred by age. On the back were 4 words: "He finally found peace." Billy never responded to the letter Elizabeth had sent after the trial. No return address, no request for contact. Just words from a mother who had missed too much time to ask for more. But she received that envelope and she knew. He had read it. And in some way, he had forgiven her. Elizabeth never returned to the bench. Her resignation had been quiet, graceful. No scandal, just the end of a long service. She moved to a small coastal town where she spent mornings walking by the water and evenings writing letters she never sent. Sometimes she'd pause to watch the sunset and whisper a name she no longer had to hide. Billy. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect even for a moment, consider subscribing. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that nearly went untold. Subscribe for more stories that stay with you.